He says, "As I am saved by grace, so I live, serve, minister, and lead by grace." So grace is not just something that relaxes me and gives me a ticket into heaven and sets me at ease. It's also what shapes the way I live. It changes the way that I serve, and it changes the way that I minister and lead.
Hey, welcome to the Overflow Podcast. This is a podcast on a mission to discover how you and I can live a life of abundance, full to overflowing. In this first season, we're unpacking biblical principles on gifts like love, grace, and forgiveness, and how we can better receive them and pass them on to others. This is episode 5. My name is Carl Lindsay, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Philip Milosavljevic. How's it going, Philip?
Carl, good to hear your voice, brother. I am doing really well. Just visited my family in Washington.
Fantastic.
We went whitewater rafting and got to take my little 1.5-year-old to the river that her mother grew up on. And so we just had a great time.
That's up in Leavenworth area, you said?
Leavenworth, Washington. Yeah, in the Cascade Mountains.
Spot.
What's going on in your life, Carl?
Not too much. I'm missing summer. I'm missing backpacking. I went backpacking up there a few years ago. It's just a stunning area. Yeah, not too much here, but guess what? We got a review on Apple Podcasts. Someone made a comment and said, "This podcast offers interesting topics with biblical commentary alongside information from other fields. Really appreciated the inclusion of attachment theory in the last episode." So I want to thank you for listening. Thank you for sending us a review. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please leave us a review. We're really excited to be launching this podcast and starting this journey, and we're glad to have you guys along for the ride.
Absolutely. And if you feel an inkling to share anything that has touched you, that's the great way that you can just help our podcast grow in its influence. And also, if you even tag us on Instagram, we'd be happy to repost your post as well. So you can find us on Instagram as well.
At Choose to Overflow, yeah. Today we got a conversation looking at grace. Well, last week we talked about grace a little bit, and now we're going to get into another conversation with Pastor Ken Curtis. He is a pastor in Southern California and a disciple of Jesus. And yeah, I just met him a few minutes ago, and he's sharing his story with me. But yeah, he's got some interesting things to share with us. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, Ken has been in my life over the years. He's been, you could say, a spiritual mentor. He's been part of a collective of pastors who's been under this kind of spiritual guidance collectively that happened in our conference almost 3 decades ago. And I met Ken there at the spiritual retreat, and we stayed in touch. And he gave a lecture on grace that just shifted the way I think about how God approaches me, my ministry, leadership. It was just very meaningful. And so I thought, how much better could it be than to share what he presented to our group of leaders on this podcast. And I think having him on this show, it will be a huge asset to our listeners.
That's wonderful. Ken, welcome to the show. We're glad to have you. Yeah, thanks for your time to come join us today.
Yeah, it's good to be with you guys. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, this will be good. So I just wanted to recap a little bit last week, because it's also on grace. We talked about what grace is, the role it plays, and why it's important to understand if we're chasing an overflowing life. So what we talked about was that grace is the transformational power of God, how it is unmerited favor that turns us to Christ. It increases our faith and affection for him, which then becomes a catalyst for bearing fruit in our lives.
And through grace, God really is adopting you into his family. That was a really important thing that we covered. So God is completely rewriting your identity. A lot of times we think about identity theories in psychosocial development of a person. And many theorists talk about how identity shapes who you end up becoming. Well, when you think about now the psychosocial theory development spiritually, you're thinking that when you add a component to your life that it could change everything. Absolutely, it can. And that is grace. And so there's two things in essence to remember with this. Number one is that God is on our side. He desires the best for you and me. And secondly, he will freely give us the things that we cannot provide for ourselves. This is completely understood in this mindset. Grace cannot be earned. You can't do enough to receive this. This is God's blessing for you.
Today, we want to look at how we can open up our lives to accepting grace in every area of our lives. Because we often say how we understand that it works, or we understand how it works, but we often live as though we don't believe it. We try and fix the problems in our own lives and on our own, and we're trying to grow on our own. It just doesn't work like that.
And that really causes us to be running from God instead of running to God. We need to really come boldly, as Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16 says, run boldly to the throne of grace so that you can obtain his mercy, and then you find that grace that you need in your times of need. So let's jump into the questions. Ken, we're really interested to see what you think about these issues, and from your 30 years of spiritual growth and mentorship that you've offered so many other Christian leaders over this season as both a pastor and a spiritual mentor. How would you define grace, and what is its power in the life of a person?
Well, actually, I think you've done a pretty good job of defining grace and how you've introduced this today. I guess to that, I would just add that grace is living in the awareness of what you have just described, that we are loved and valued unconditionally by a God who at the core of God's own being is love. So the whole idea of love and grace are concepts that are so intertwined together, you can't tease them apart.
Yeah.
So it's living in that awareness that God really is like that. That is what it means to live responsively a life of grace. And the power in that is that it changes everything, as you've intimated already in the introduction when you were introducing me just a moment ago. It's the power that changes us. And the person who I think has encapsulated this the best for me was a mentor of mine from about 30 years ago. He was one of the founders of a group called the Leadership Institute. And I met with him on a number of different retreats. But the one sentence that he repeated over and over again at the various times that we were together was simply this. His name was Wayne Anderson. He says, "As I am saved by grace, so I live, serve, minister, and lead by grace."
That's good.
So grace is not just something that relaxes me and gives me a ticket into heaven and sets me at ease. It's also what shapes the way I live. It changes the way that I serve, and it changes the way that I minister and lead. Leadership by grace looks very different than leadership in other kinds of contexts.
Wow. What do you mean by that last phrase there? How does grace actually change your leadership?
There are a number of models of leadership that you can look at that are just there for our consumption in the culture. A lot of various businesses and various other sociologists and folks have worked together on ways that you work on leadership theory and how to develop people. And much of what they do actually does parallel some of the concepts of grace. But one of the main ways that I've seen it change leadership, and the way that it's changed leadership for me, is leadership is often involved with finding ways to motivate people to move forward and to grow. And the tricky thing is that sometimes the methods that seem to work the best and the quickest are not the ones that are the best for us in the long run. In other words, it's much easier for me to motivate someone through a sense of fear or anxiety than it is to motivate someone through love and grace. Yeah. And all you have to do to see that lived out in your life is to reflect on what it means to be a parent. I mean, if you don't have kids of your own, or if you do have kids of your own, you know how your desire is to find ways to encourage them to do the things they need to do out of a sense of love and responsibility. And sometimes that works really well. And sometimes, no matter how well you model that and how well you encourage that, it doesn't get the behavior you want. And so what parents tend to do, and under those circumstances, and which I am ashamed to say that I have fallen back to at various times in my parenting life, is that if I can't motivate by love and grace, I know if I raise the anxiety level a bit, I can get kids to do what I want them to do.
Yeah.
It's much quicker, it's much more efficient, it's much faster.
Oh, yeah.
But
long term, you're saying that it's not so great.
oh no, because all you've done now is trained a bunch of people to respond when they're anxious and fearful. And you've not changed character at all in a helpful kind of way. I mean, they're not doing it because that's who they are. They're doing that because it's become much more comfortable to comply than it is to resist. So that's one of the ways that leadership changes. I still remember a conversation I had with an administrator at an educational institution that I was connected to a number of years ago, who I used to meet with as a pastor, and just kind of have an opportunity to listen to him and to pray with him for the faculty that he was leading. And there was a statement he made to me once that has always haunted me. And the statement was basically, he said, it's always good that if you keep your staff just a little bit off balance, just a little bit anxious, because they perform so much better that way. And I thought, oh, how sad. I mean, he's a wonderful guy in every other way and a very gracious person in a lot of ways. But he'd bought into a theory of leadership that says that really, if you're going to lead people well, that you have to keep them just a little anxious, a little worried, a little bit unsure of what you're going to do next. And that gives them that edge that makes them perform better.
That's terrible.
It is. Not to mention what it does to the relationship between, an administrator and a faculty, or between anyone in a position of leadership. But
yeah. In that note, in terms of being scared, I think a lot of us find the throne of grace that Philip just mentioned in Hebrews 4:16. So many of us find that throne of grace scary. Can you talk us through that and why that is the case?
Yes, I think for some of the reasons that I just sort of mentioned in the illustration, when we think of an all-powerful being who is good sitting on a throne and being brought into their presence and realizing that they are so much bigger and so much better and occupying a sphere of existence that's so much above me. When you walk into the presence of a person like that, who is seated with that kind of power at their disposal, if I walk into that in a way that I have framed it with anxiety, I immediately assume that because that person is in the position that they're in, that they are going to be looking at me with a sense of disdain, a sense that they are so much bigger than I am anyway, and I am less than they are, and that they're probably there to be critical and to find out what is wrong with me. Now, that's a very different frame of reference than if I walk into that same setting where I see this being that is so big and so huge and so good and so competent and so amazing. And I realize that that is a person who loves me unconditionally and longs for nothing more than to embrace me. But that's not what I usually associate when I think of somebody sitting in a position of power.
No.
Because most people in a position of power, once they get there, their agenda becomes to preserve their position of power and to make sure that they can make everyone else do what they want them to do.
And so that's the way we see
It's a very
God.
different thing. Yeah. And I think that's why coming before the throne of grace, even though we say we're coming to the throne of grace, the picture of the throne and the power that it represents and the sense of anxiety of knowing that you don't measure up and that you're not going to meet the standard and that somehow you might be thought less of or even punished for that makes it a very uncomfortable kind of experience.
I think of AA, the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, and the very first step that is just so unique to this program, which is known to be a program that could be applicable to anyone of any religious background. But the very first one is, we admit we're powerless over alcohol, that our lives have become unmanageable. And then the second step is then you come to believe that a power greater than yourself can restore you to sanity. But you can't get to step 2 without getting to step 1. I cannot do this on my own.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's a tough place to get to. In fact, when I've talked with people about the AA program and about how they've used that as kind of a model to develop, one of the things that has been very consistent in the conversations I've had is how hard it is for people to get to step 1, because we really don't believe that there's not something we have to contribute. And it's humiliating to come to the place to say, I can't be good enough. I can't change the things about me that really need to be changed. I really do need to rely on the grace and love of a being bigger than I am. Which is why, I mean, AA is a good example. There's usually only 2 ways that we actually get to that place. I mean, one, a path that very few people find and take is the path of insight and wisdom, where suddenly it just dawns on you that this is the way it is. And you say, oh, now this all makes sense. I can respond to God and let him have access to my life. Or you're in so much pain that you finally realize that all the other options haven't worked. When you finally come to the end of yourself and realize, I've exhausted everything else.
Yeah.
There's just no way.
Wow.
So for people who haven't gotten there, it's a tricky thing. You know, sometimes it's like a parent who says, you know, you don't have to live like this, but you can for a while. And when you'd like to try something new, I'm ready to help. But it's really hard to talk someone into taking that step if they don't catch the insight, or they just haven't felt enough pain to realize it doesn't work the other way.
There was someone in my life that was very close to me who was dealing with serious addiction, and they found themselves at a point living in a basement that was half flooded, mice there, and they were just continuing in their addiction. And it was so strange to me, where I'm like, gosh, that must be the end of my rope. But they were like, well, at least I have somewhere to stay at night, you know? And I was like, whoa, what in the world? You're in a flooded basement. You have rats down there. You don't even have a job. You're college, almost educated, and you don't feel like you're at the end of your rope yet. You're going to still, you know. So I resonate with you, Ken, in the realization that, hey, sometimes it's just tough to get to number 1. You know, how do you know you're at the end of your rope? That's a big one. That's a big one. Now, in this discussion about grace, I mean, we want to get to a point, though, where we're beyond just step 1. We want to be in a space where we live an overflowing life with grace. Can you talk to us about how grace works to transform our hearts? How has grace changed your leadership, friendship with others, and even your relationship with God, maybe?
Yeah. Well, I guess I would start by saying I'm not sure that we ever do get over step 1. I think what we do is we get to a place where we learn to keep pushing through step 1, because step 1 always hangs in the background.
You have to always realize that we are messed up, and we need to be humble. And
just to realize that I really can't do this on my own.
Yeah.
That I really need to let go of that paradigm. The problem is that paradigm is so much a part of us that it's very hard to shake that. I mean, from the time that we're very small, we learn, if our family doesn't teach us, the world around us teaches us that our value is dependent on how well we perform, on what we produce, on what other people think about us, about the control we have over the things around us. Essentially, the 3 temptations of Jesus, you know, that's what our identity is about.
Yeah.
But where we need to come to is the place, again, which came just before the 3 temptations of Jesus, where we're hearing the Father's voice speak to us saying, you are my beloved child. With you, I am well pleased. That is who you are. So you don't have to do this to be that person. You don't have to achieve this level of of people loving you and thinking you're, the greatest thing to know you're of value. You don't have to control and have power over things or people to know that. You can know it based on who I am and
Yep.
who I have told you you are in the relationship that we have together. So as you move through step one, which is coming to the place and saying, I am who I am because of what God says about me, not because of any of the other resources that I have, then it's a matter of trying to find a way to maintain that stance, to stay in that place, so that when I'm feeling anxious or when I'm feeling tempted or when I'm feeling like things are not going well, I don't revert back to doing one of those other things to try to make myself feel okay. I can stop and say, I am the beloved son or daughter of God, and God is well pleased with me right now. I don't have to do that in order to have that. But now that I know that, I can deal with that thing that I need to deal with.
You mentioned a little bit of your story before when you were talking with me before we pressed records, and you mentioned how grace has been influential there. So talk to me a little bit about that story. Share a little bit of your story with becoming a Christian and moving into friendship with God, friendship with others.
I was not raised in a church-going home. I mean, both my mom and dad, if you would ask them, would say that they believed in God, but we never went to church. We didn't practice anything. Curiously, my mom taught me a rote prayer that I said every night when I went to bed. But that was the extent of my religious training growing up.
Yeah.
But I knew that God was out there and that God somehow made sense out of the world, but it just wasn't a part of my life.
Okay.
Later on, through a series of interesting events, I became more interested, began going to church. But curiously enough, it was in church that I began to realize that maybe God was not as friendly as I thought he was. That's where you begin to hear about the standards that were not being kept and the behavior that was not adequate and the God who punished sinners and the fact that Jesus was coming again soon and are you ready? But somehow in the midst of all of that, I was experiencing the same kind of motivation that I had mentioned that I had described to me by the administrator at the school that I was at, where I was feeling very anxious. And so I was very motivated to learn because if Jesus was coming soon, I didn't want to be among those who were lost. And I still remember the joyful experience of sitting on my bed in my bedroom one Sabbath afternoon. I had mentioned that I was keeping Sabbath by then, even though it was for all the wrong reasons, and my parents thought I was crazy. But I was reading Steps to Christ. And the first couple of chapters on faith and acceptance, it just basically said, you just need to stop this and believe that when God tells you this, that it's true, that these promises really are for you, essentially. I'm paraphrasing horribly here, without going back and actually reading this, but I remember that's where it was in the book. And I can remember that afternoon having this sense of peace wash over me because for the first time I realized that it wasn't about me. It wasn't about performing. It wasn't about any of that. It was about believing that God actually did love me and had extended this gift to me and just invited me to come. It changed everything. It's just like we had a whole different frame around the picture now.
That's powerful.
So at that point in time, I could approach the throne of grace, not fearful and shaking from terror, although I still might be very nervous when I approach the throne of grace, but I'm nervous for a different reason now. Not because I'm afraid of the hostility of the God that sits on the throne, but because I'm standing in the presence of someone who is so incredibly good and loving beyond my ability to even wrap my mind around what that means, and who has given me a gift that is so profound, I don't even know how to describe it, much less respond to it. And I'm standing in the presence of that being, and it's like, who am I to be here? It's not because I'm afraid that he's going to smack me because, there's sin about me somewhere. But the sense of, this is too good. I don't belong in the presence of someone this good. But this person is telling me I belong. So it's a different kind of trembling as I'm standing there before that. It's not a trembling from terror, fear, but kind of this awesomeness, like this is so overwhelming, I don't even know what to say. So
That's powerful.
yeah, it's a whole different frame at that point.
Yeah. So I guess a question then is there a connection then between receiving that grace, like you talked about when you're in high school, receiving that grace from God and then extending it to others? What's the connection from step 1 to step 2? Does our unwillingness to admit that we're a mess get in the way of us extending grace to those around us?
Oh yeah, I mean, if we still think that who we are is based on how well we're performing, why would we let anybody else off the hook? I mean, think about what it's costing us already to feel that way. It's like, I'm not measuring up. I've got to do this. I can't admit that anything's wrong because if I do, people will judge me badly. And so one of the ways I feel better about myself is not to make sure that nobody else is getting off easy either, because maybe I might be doing a little bit better than they are at least, or it's just not fair, if they get off the hook and I don't.
Maybe that's why many people don't extend grace enough to others, because they have been operating out of a mindset that's set in their own works and their own justification for who they are based on their merits, or how they feel about their merits, and what they've kind of proved to the world. So if you feel like you've done much, or you've even maybe not been extended much grace, you're going to be real critical with the world around you, and you won't have much to give. So that's a tough place, and it's unfortunate when that comes in the place where it's supposed to be a safe zone, like the church.
Yeah.
So I guess I would ask you a question then, Ken. Last week we kind of touched on the space of, hey, when church becomes a dangerous place to admit you're broken and need help because you feel judgment exists there. People won't look at you the same. What can we do to help churches grow into communities of grace?
Yeah, sometimes it's just small and subtle things. Sometimes it's something as simple as changing the language. At our church, we spend a lot of time talking about how we want to be the people of God before we do the work of God. So when we gather for a board meeting, or we gather for a finance committee meeting, or we gather for any official meeting where we are going to work on a task or be thinking about how we're going to administer something, we want to spend some time together first listening to God. So we spend some time in the Word. It has nothing to do with what the agenda is going to be here, at least often we don't think it does. And then spending some time talking about, so what are we hearing from each other? What's going on in our lives that passage is speaking into? And have a little bit of time practicing what it means to be that community together before we start talking about, so what are the things we need to address?
I love that.
That's powerful.
But taking the time to be that community before you try to do the work of the community helps to shape what the work looks like. Otherwise, you move immediately into that place where you're saying, so what is the task that needs to be done? How do we evaluate how effective we're being? Or what's the cost-benefit ratio? That's a very different conversation than the one that grows out of spending time in the Word, praying for each other, talking about what's going on in our lives, and then looking at something and saying, oh, this is not about how much we produce. This talks about the kind of people we are as we're out there trying to engage whatever that problem is.
Yeah.
And sure, we wanted to get better, but we're measuring it differently. It's not how much we produce. It's how well were we there? How well were we engaged? Did we reflect Jesus in what we were doing? So I think that's one way. And as you kind of build that more and more into the fabric of the church, it begins to change the way people think and the way that they do things. And they say, oh, this is a place where I can come and I can be in God's presence with other people, and we can be alongside of each other, and we can, and it's safe. But I think those are some small little things that sometimes are just enough to change the culture, change the frame around the picture. Yeah. Or begin to nudge it in directions where it can build up some momentum on its own.
Yeah.
I think that's a small enough change, or it's a micro shift with macro results. Just simply stating, hey, we are first the people of God before we do the works of God. I mean, that is big. It's literally saying, wait, my identity is in this, and therefore that shapes what I do. That's pretty big, Ken. So thank you for that. Thank you.
Yeah, and you also have to remember there at that point, who are the people of God? You have to have a definition surrounding that identity.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so as we close here, I wanted to ask if you have any questions that you can leave with us, leave with our listeners, that we can ponder this week to help us toward that place of growth. We've talked this week and last week about grace being that place of transformation. So, yeah, what are some questions that we can think about to help us move toward that place of growth?
That's a very interesting question, because there are a set of questions that have been a part of the journey of the church for thousands of years now, that have been practiced by believers in lots of different settings, different places around the world. And the essence of the questions that they say we need to think about are to, well, you could describe it this way, to spend a little bit of time at the end of each day and reflect on two questions. Where today did I see grace in my interactions with people or around me? Where were the places where I saw indications of grace? And how did I respond to it? Did I respond to it? Did I try to block it? Did I engage it? Did I walk away? And then the other question is to notice the places where it was blocked, either by someone else or by yourself. Why was I unwilling to extend grace in that situation? What was that about? And how do I bring that before God and say, this is a place of work in my life? Where are the places where you're working out of anxiety? Where are the places where you're feeling like you need to somehow establish yourself? And those open up places where then I need to say, this is a wounded place that I need to bring to God. This is an area, this is a growing edge for me. And the contention is if you spend time prayerfully reflecting on those questions each day, you start to become aware of where grace is actually already surfacing in your life, and where there are things that are surfacing in your life that are blocking that, so that you can be more aware when those moments come to say, I'm going this way in this situation. I'm going to take this path.
Well, Ken, thank you so very much. We really appreciate your time. We appreciate your thoughts. Our viewers definitely do. You've brought up some really important things for us to consider and to reflect upon. These last two questions, I think, if you didn't say anything, these two would have been it for me today. I just feel as though I'm going to be thinking about these myself. So thank you so much, Ken.
It's been a pleasure.
Those are some powerful questions. I want to remind you as listeners that we'll have a reflection guide available on our website, choosetooverflow.com, where you can kind of download a PDF that has those questions and a couple more that we can kind of just think about as we dream about, as we move towards a place of growth in grace and being able to extend it to others.
As we do each time, we want to leave our listeners with a blessing. And so right now, I just want to pray this blessing over you. May God fill you. May his overflowing grace bless your life today. May you recognize the places that he is speaking into your life by grace. May you continue to feed into that, and may you be a conduit of that in your life this week, to your family, to your friends, and simply just even to yourself. So may God bless you. And today, may you again choose to overflow.
Hey, thanks so much for listening in on our conversation today. If something we said made you think, or maybe you just want to say hello or give some feedback, we'd love to hear from you. You can send us an email at hello@choosetooverflow.com. You can find us on Instagram at choosetooverflow, or check out our website, choosetooverflow.com, where you can find more content, including a reflection guide for today's episode to help you take the conversation further. That's choosetooverflow.com. We also want to thank the Loma Linda University Church for their support of this project. And if this was helpful to you, please leave us a review, share with a friend or three, and subscribe to stay connected. We'll be releasing new episodes every Monday. Thanks again for listening. We hope you choose to overflow this week. Let's chat again soon.